today. Thank you all for sticking around and staying so focused and engaged. We really appreciate it. As Franca mentioned, this last panel of the day is meant to be not so much a summary, but kind of a connecting the dots across everything we've talked about today. And we're going to keep it pretty fast-paced. We promise we won't go over time. And if we end early, we recognize we're standing between you and the happy hour. I thought we should maybe set up the bar so people could have a drink for this last session, but I was overruled. So without further ado, I do want to introduce, we have three wonderful panelists, and I'm excited to talk to them about some of the things that we've heard today. Natalie Dunleavy Campbell is the head of North American regulation for the Internet Society Mothership, which is a really big gig, and we're so delighted to partner with her and with the Internet Society on so many things. It's a pleasure to be working with you, and I'm excited to have you here today. And then we also have Bill Abbott, who's the Director of Regulatory Affairs for TELUS. And Bill has a really unique perspective. I know we've talked a little bit about telcos today, but I promise you're going to like him as much as I do. He's really thoughtful on these issues. And so I would ask you to keep an open mind. And then we have Josh, it's Tabish, right? Thank you. And I have, and Josh is awesome and thoughtful, and you're going to learn a lot from him. And I've walked past him literally 10 times today on my way to see somebody else and haven't even barely said hello. So I apologize. But Josh is the Senior Director for Canada for the Chamber for Progress, which is a really good organization that does good things. And he's going to tell us a little bit more about that in the context of all of this as well. But and I want each of you to talk a little bit more about your areas of focus, but maybe just to keep things kind of high energy for this last panel of the day. Let's start off with some hot takes. Is that cool? Awesome. Okay, so hot takes, quick reactions on what stood out from the day. Did anything really surprise you? Did you think something was missing? Was there something that felt underexplored? Just we'll do rapid fire and just keep moving the mic around. Go.
Thanks, Lena. So part of my job at the Internet Society is helping governments around the world understand the impact of regulation and laws on the Internet. And one of the things we've been studying since 2022 is the concept of digital sovereignty, because this isn't a term that's just being used in Canada, it's been used all around the world. And what could be the impact of the efforts to achieve such digital sovereignty on the actual Internet. So we did a study in 2022. And the reason I'm sharing this is that, our big finding was that nobody has a common definition. There's different motivations for digital sovereignty. Sometimes it's economic reasons. Sometimes it's to have legal jurisdiction over data. And sometimes it's because countries want a walled garden like we see in China. A lot of what I heard today is very consistent with our study, right? There's no common definition. I think everyone had different definition, and that's really cool. But I think what struck out to me is that it's really important to be clear about what it is we actually want, because if we aren't very clear about our goals and what we're trying to achieve, we could find ourselves on a path that is not actually steering us on the path of the Internet, and maybe something that's closer to that walled garden approach.
Thank you. Hi there. For me, I'm not sure how many of you were here in the morning, but I have sort of two hot takes. One was the address by Jeff Doctor on sort of using the First Nations or Indigenous experience as a way of viewing sovereignty, because I've got to say I've always had that awkward feeling after a land acknowledgement, and you feel a little awkward, and then you get to the substantive part, whatever it is you're doing at the meeting, but you really have to reflect on that part, because it's tough. And I have a house that is undoubtedly on First Nations land. I don't particularly want to, I've raised a family there, don't particularly want to compensate someone else for it or give it up or even share it. But you always want to do the right thing. And that's sort of a really deep internal struggle. But I really appreciated that Jeff ended on a positive note, which is the past is going to be difficult to undo, but we can do the future differently and better, and we can learn from the past. So that was kind of a hot take, and at a possible, as you may have heard, I'm I work for a scrappy little tech startup called TELUS, and we do try in that area. And we're a platinum sponsor of Indigenomics, and we have Indigenous reconciliation action plans. It's in our data ethics, and it's also in our responsible AI program, which includes not using First Nations cultural property, particularly the graphic property, as an input to AI or to output graphic representations. We will pay someone from the First Nations to produce that for us. So I'm not saying we're all the way there, and it gets to land use as well, particularly in Alberta and BC. On I used to have a team of 10 privacy partners when I was with the privacy group, and they all took OCAP training, and a couple of them joined in on the Indigenous Reconciliation Action Plan. So there are things we can do. There's always more we can do. That really struck me. Another thing that struck me was the change in the nature of the discussion in the last 8 months when it comes to digital sovereignty and particularly AI sovereignty and AI policy. If you think back to the fall, when there was like the G7 and the B7, all that kind of stuff, AI policy was all about industrial policy, investments, innovation. How do we do this fast? But I think we've gone from light, tight, and right to hopefully an all-in approach that sort of also, in addition to those very important industrial policies, focuses on some of the socioeconomic things we really need to worry about. Like the AI is just a tool. It can do good things. It can do bad things. Policy should maximize the good, minimize the bad. And I think of democracy, mental health, employment, even like human free will and its potential impacts on those. I am so glad that, and cybersecurity for that matter, I know we've been, seen a fair bit of mythos and anthropics. I'm glad that the discussion in the last 8 months around AI has gone from industrial policy to a broader perspective. Very hopeful for what's coming down the pipe on the national AI strategy. My fingers are crossed that it will carry through. Those are my things.
Cool. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Josh, and I'm going to share my 2 hot takes with you. So first, this morning, we heard Professor Laidlaw talk about how even if your data is in Canada, it still may be subject to extra-jurisdictional request and access from the U.S. and other countries. And we heard Professor Geist elaborate on that again this afternoon. And so I think one thing that has really stood out to me is we often emphasize location when we talk about data, but we may be oversimplifying things. That data is still vulnerable to access, but the good news is there are things we can do to protect it, and we'll get into that in a bit. I also think that discussion has so far, and I think our panel will change this, that discussion so far has missed the impact that legislation like Bill C-22 could have on unauthorized foreign or other access to Canadians' data. And so we'll be getting into that later, I'm sure. The second thing I'd say quickly is, while I was sitting in the last panel, I got a push notification that that Minister Miller is very seriously considering a social media ban for kids in this country. It's very much on the table by the sounds of it. And we are sitting in front of a sign that says the internet is for everyone. And it's odd to me that at no point today has the social media ban come up yet. Whatever your views are about social media bans, and I know it's a divisive topic, the internet a very large slice of the internet could suddenly not be available for people under 14 or 16 or whatever very soon. So I just wanted to call that out. And I'll pass it back to our fabulous moderator.
Thanks so much. I'm going to take a moderator's prerogative and be a panelist for a minute. I want to add one thing that I really loved hearing was just the number of voices talking about these issues, both on the stage and in the networking sessions, and the fact that people come at these things with some, shared interest or areas of, goals, I guess. There's some alignment around different aspects of various topics we've talked about from a goals or an outcomes perspective, but everyone brings a really unique sort of knowledge base and set of experiences to that conversation. And it directly connects to what Shelley was just talking about on the last panel about the fact that it's an ecosystem, it's a community. These are large systemic issues that have grown over time with the advent of AI and with obviously the quantum stuff that's coming at us is pretty big. I bet you next Digital Access Day, we're going to be talking about quantum a lot. That is only accelerating, and it is going to take all of us working together, bringing those different perspectives, playing different roles, but complementary ones to really address some of these issues in a healthy and productive and constructive and successful way. So I thought that was really cool and very kind of inspirational. So thank you for that, for everybody who's participated so far today. Any other hot takes you want to talk about, or are we good to move on to some questions about tensions? Okay, trade-offs is a word that has been used and then kind of pointed out as maybe the wrong way to think about it. I prefer to think of these things as tensions and things that are interrelated rather than a zero-sum game of the trade-off. But what are some key tensions that you all heard coming forward today? And Bill has this really great, I'm going to start with you, Bill, because he has this really great analogy to a dimmer switch. And I want to ask, once he explains what that means, for some of these pieces, where should we be setting the dimmer switch? We'll come back to that. But Bill.
And I totally ripped off that analogy from someone I don't know who, but it was the idea, Minister Solomon early on was talking about sovereignty as being, what are you left with when someone throws the switch and turns off? That's what you have. And I think we need to approach digital sovereignty and especially AI sovereignty in a more sort of subtle way. It's more like a dimmer switch, because we have to face the fact that Canada is a relatively small trading nation. Our well-being is partly dependent on the free flow of goods and services. Now, one of these tensions is, at the same time, we're very vulnerable. We are vulnerable to, as we now know very well, to certain other countries, but any country out there, when we are so interconnected with other countries. We are also very vulnerable to, frankly, I'm more worried about Sam Altman than the U.S. in the long run. But it's, to large hyperscalers. We are never, it's not on off. Like if we have sovereignty, everything has to be Canadian. It can't work that way. We need a dimmer switch. There are times when you need to turn the sovereignty up on national security, health, utilities, things like that. There are other times when you can turn the sovereignty dimmer switch down because it needs to be a proportionate response. We're not going to be self-sufficient. We're not going to isolate ourselves from the rest of the world through sovereignty. But what we do need is, well, actually, to go back to something Natalie mentioned, the word sovereignty gets tossed around a lot. Digital sovereignty. What are the objectives behind it? And I there's a recent paper by Jackson Kahn and Sean Mullen about this, the issue of digital sovereignty, and they described it as freedom from coercion. That you can't be sort of coerced, even threatened, very effectively by other countries or multinationals. And I think that captures it. I like to put it more positively and say it's an issue of control. There are areas where Canadians need to have control sort of over the technology, over the operations, and corporate control as well. And, the government can be a leader in this. Probably the public sector is the most sensitive, and through tiered procurement, and have the dimmer switch turned up on certain procurement, turned down on others where it makes sense. I'm not sure if I nailed it quite as well as I did on the prep call, but I hope that helps.
I think it's really helpful, and there are a lot of pieces that feed into that, and it's hard because, to your point that you made early on, Natalie, people define this differently. But I guess then the question is if we think about it as a dimmer switch, maybe we can pull on some areas. You mentioned national security, you mentioned health, you mentioned utilities. What are the areas that we really have to be dialing up the dimmer switch, and maybe that we need to focus on as we think about how we're wrapping up the day and taking things forward? What should we really be focusing on? Maybe Josh, we'll start with you. I'll hand this down.
Thanks, sir. So when it comes to where we should focus, I hear in the public discourse about digital sovereignty on, X or in the pages of the opinion sections of our national newspapers, a lot of emphasis on location. Build it in Canada, host it in Canada, the need for a Canadian tech stack. And I think this impulse is understandable. I just worry that we're over-indexing on location, as I kind of alluded to earlier. It's very hard to escape U.S. jurisdiction. Even a minimal connection to the U.S. can leave you subject to the Cloud Act and other kinds of extraterritorial data requests. The digital sovereignty activists will say, well, what about the kill switch scenario? What if Donald Trump is unhappy with us one day and shuts off Microsoft for the entire Canadian government? And, these concerns are understandable, but they're a little unlikely, they're hypothetical. What I do think is likely is what we heard from Sammy Corey this morning and what we heard from the folks at CIRA this morning, which is that the threat landscape out there is pretty ugly when it comes to cybersecurity. And what is very likely and what is not hypothetical is that foreign states and criminal hacker groups are trying to penetrate our networks and steal commercial secrets and understand where the critical minerals are in this country. I mean, the list goes on, right? So one of my concerns about over-indexing on location, where the servers are, where the corporate headquarters is that when we move away from some of the bigger leading global services, we lose some of the benefits that come with them. And one of those benefits is very strong security, right? Think whatever your views are on the hyperscalers and American tech companies, they have economies of scale when it comes to cybersecurity that are very beneficial for people in critical infrastructure, government services, you name it. End consumers as well. And so where we have seen data breaches in Canada, it's often been in boutique, on-premises, custom services that are out there. Now, I'm not saying that all services built in Canada are going to be insecure. I don't want you to take that the wrong way. And I also am not saying that we shouldn't build our own infrastructure. I think we absolutely should. We want to be independent as a nation. We want to have a plurality of options. To speak back to what Professor Geis mentioned earlier, we want to make sure that there are Canadian options for businesses to innovate on, et cetera. But I think we need to be clear-eyed about those trade-offs, and we need to be clear-eyed about what the risks actually are versus the hypothetical risks. And that might mean battening down the hatches for critical workloads like national defense or healthcare. But one of the options we have available to us is strong encryption. Now, whether you're working with a major hyperscaler or you're working with a boutique firm, strong encryption protocols can protect Canadians' data from foreign snooping and unauthorized access. Even if the Canadian government is working with, say, Microsoft, there are solutions available to encrypt that data so that even if Microsoft is forced to hand the data over to U.S. authorities, it's a scrambled mess. And so I think when we think about where to go from here, I think encryption has to be part of the discussion. And I think an emphasis on technical controls to protecting data is just as important, or more important, frankly, than where it's stored.
I have to agree with a lot of what Josh just said. But what I would like to encourage folks to think about is when we talk about trade-offs, for me, we have to think about what does it mean to have an actual internet? And is what we're trying to achieve getting us further away from that goal? Because the internet was designed so that there shouldn't be a kill switch, right? It is decentralized. It was built to have no single authority to prevent any one person from having a kill switch. And I'm talking about the infrastructure of the internet. That doesn't necessarily mean individual services that use the internet to offer their products, but I'm talking about the infrastructure of the internet. That's why I get worried when I hear, suggestions that, well, maybe we need to control the tech stack. Maybe the answer to sovereignty is we need to control everything. If that is something that helps align with your version of sovereignty and you're okay with that, meaning that doesn't necessarily lead to an internet, cool. But I think a lot of people might not understand what the internet really actually means to exist in the first place. And because of that, if we go about certain solutions to achieve any one of the many goals we talked about today to achieve sovereignty, my worry is that if we forget about thinking through whether this could get us further away from an internet, that we might be getting closer to a version of the internet that we can't trust to actually do what we want it to do.
Thanks, Natalie. And Josh, great point about encryption. Bill, did you want to add anything else on this? Yeah, do it.
This is where I get to disagree with both of the other panelists. With respect to the potential threats to, I hope I'm not misinterpreting this, Josh, being hypothetical, to me, I actually find them very real. Like 8 months ago, if you'd said the U.S. might hypothetically close off the Straits of Hormuz and turn off oil for 20% of the world, that's highly hypothetical, and it is happening. So it's a wild and crazy world out there. I think we need to be prepared. And then sort of with respect to, and thinking of encryption, that's great when it comes to, what happens to your information if it's been accessed by a third party, but access to the internet and the applications that ride on top of it are vital to the operation of our society. And there's a certain minimum level that a nation state really needs to be able to sustain. So encryption is part of the answer. As far as securing information, it is not the total answer for a state to be able to say we have a reasonable level of digital sovereignty. And I think we have to start with, in a way, it's totally valid to say, hey, what services do we need this high level of sovereignty for? But I think the first step is defining sovereignty, and it comes down, in my view, like that's something the government could do very helpfully, is define sovereignty for our purposes. I think it goes to control at all levels, like not only location, hardware, software, security, the workforce, and define different levels of sovereignty that might be required in public procurement. And I think that really starts to solidify what we're talking about. And that is part of ensure that this isn't a matter of balkanizing the internet or balkanizing AI. It's a matter of making sure it's there when you need it within a state.
If I could just quickly add on to that. So I really get the worries that are where this is coming from, right? I get that people want to be able to trust that they can turn on the internet and still have access to their data and their services, and that nobody's going to turn a switch off and then you don't have access to your entire livelihood online. I think, though, the way that we go about achieving that trust, that security, that resilience in our infrastructure is not necessarily fragmenting ourselves from the internet, but supporting more options, supporting more, for example, community-driven networks who can build internet access solutions on their own terms that align with their own visions of sovereignty. That is also great for Canada's entire internet because it increases resiliency and redundancy, and it helps keep more data local. But it does so in a way that doesn't contribute to a walled garden. It just benefits everyone. So what I'm trying to encourage folks to think about is maybe some of the goals that we're trying to achieve with digital sovereignty can be achieved by getting closer to the aspirations of the internet that are open, globally connected, secure, and trustworthy. And how can we work towards those goals in a way that helps us achieve what we're talking about in conversations about digital sovereignty today?
Thank you. Yeah. Open, secure, trustworthy, big themes that resonated throughout the day. And we're going to be talking a little bit more in another minute about another threat to the health of the global internet. And also, I, again, wanted to raise two other tensions that I thought came up today. One, because I said we were not going to get through this day without talking about competition policy, and here it is. The tension between wanting to have choice of Canadian companies to work with across the tech stack comes down to a question of whether, it was talked about on the panel this morning, whether we have the kind of economy that supports the starting and the scaling of businesses that can meet those needs. And the reality is that we know the numbers are high of businesses that start here and move elsewhere because that's where they can scale. So I think there's a tension there we need to be paying close attention to. And I think competition policy is a big part of whether we can make something like a goal of digital sovereignty actually real in practice. And then separately, another theme that came up throughout the day was the need for that legal infrastructure. And so on the theme of legal infrastructure, we've kind of walked around the issue of Bill C-22 a little bit, but we're going to tackle it directly here. Maybe, Natalie, you can give us a quick take on C-22. There are some good things about it. There are some not so good things about it. And what are, in the view of all of the panelists, the implications for access and for privacy and innovation? What are the risks? We talk a lot at the Internet Society about the risks of unintended consequences. Policy and regulation, when it is related to really complex matters, particularly issues that are highly technical, are nuanced. And there are often unintended consequences. And I think this is a situation where we're facing that risk as well.
Thank you. So just a quick TLDR on C-22. So C-22 is a bill that was formerly tucked in within C-2 Strong Borders Act, but was removed and introduced as its own thing. And essentially, it is a lawful access bill that is intended to help law enforcement get access to information to support investigations to stop crime. I will say that, as someone who works at the Internet Society and has worked there for many, many years, we pay attention to these kinds of bills all over the world a lot because they often involve providing law enforcement access to information in a way that undermines encryption. And as Josh mentioned before, encryption is like the bricks and mortar of security online. Everybody on it, everybody depends on it every single day in every aspect of your life that touches the internet. All of the time, and we take it for granted. So with Bill 72, the Internet Society is especially concerned, and I have to say, this is our top legislative concern all around the world right now, and we track bills all over the world. Because what it does is it gives the government power to issue secret orders to any service that exists in Canada and uses the internet to help law enforcement with investigations and in a way that could undermine encryption. And they have exceptions in it to say, well, you don't have to do it if it's going to contribute to systemic vulnerability. But they're not sufficient to protect against orders that force services and companies essentially to engineer vulnerability into their systems, into their services. And we also know that, the department that is introducing this law doesn't necessarily agree with the way that most cybersecurity experts define systemic vulnerability. And given that the Prime Minister just a few months ago said, well, we want to use lawful access bill so that we can get access to private communications to stop crime, I don't have a lot of confidence that when the folks that are promoting this bill are saying that, well, no, we're not going to undermine encryption. The Prime Minister is on the record saying they want access to encrypted information. So the reason that this is our top security legislative threat around the world that we're tracking at the Internet Society is because you're essentially creating a power that the government could use to force every single service in Canada to bake in vulnerability into their systems, and that includes internet infrastructure. If we can't trust that we're using the internet in a way that the infrastructure itself, the guts of the internet, is using every possible means to secure our experiences, the businesses that we're creating, the innovation that we're doing, how can we trust our ability to use the internet in a way that's not going to harm our economy, that is not going to harm national security, that is not going to lead to less safe spaces for kids online? It's extremely concerning from a whole range of perspectives. But I think it's really relevant to the conversations today. We heard from folks saying, I think the stat was 98% of companies in Canada are small to medium-sized enterprises. And then we heard in other conversations that folks are really struggling with the basics of cybersecurity into their businesses. And we're also in an era where the pace of cybersecurity threats is outpacing our human abilities to stop them, because the folks that are looking to find these vulnerabilities are now using AI tools that can find them in minutes as opposed to maybe hours or days. They're finding, and all it takes is one vulnerability. We can do everything we can. We are always having to scan all of the vulnerabilities and to be patching things, and yet all it takes is one vulnerability, and you could be out of business. You could lose, it could destroy an entire economy. Not to mention, it will create a honeypot in Canada. If attackers know that these lawful access orders exist, it will turn Canada into a honeypot. Folks like Brent will be employed for years and years and years to come, which might be a good thing for Brent, but not a great thing for our economy, for finding economic resilience, for, wanting to be able to use AI in ways that is not putting us more at risk, our families. So I really think that when we're talking about digital sovereignty, for whatever reason and whatever way we need to achieve it, we have to make sure that we're not also passing laws that undermine our very ability to use the internet in a way that is secure and that gives us the autonomy to be using it in a way that is secure and using every tool at our disposal to keep it that way.
Thank you, Natalie. I'll just say the Canadian Internet Society is on record with our position around C22. We've, I think, published areas where we think the content is good and areas where we have concerns. And we have a couple of our board members in the audience today who are going to be testifying in front of the Senate on this very issue this evening. And so they'll miss our happy hour. But all for a very good cause. Before we leave the issue, Bill, Josh, do you have anything you want to touch on with respect to C22?
Famous last words. I think I may be suffering some Stockholm syndrome, because over 25 years, there have been 5 earlier iterations of this, and some of them were truly Orwellian. So I have to give my head a shake every now and then, say, lawful access, C22, it is, I've seen worse, seen much worse. It still needs work. I will give the government credit that between C2 and 22, they went back. There was consultation with Murray Rankin. It was, selective, not public. But, and I think there were significant improvements. I would say 3 areas, and I'm largely agree with the panelists, 3 areas of real concern for me. Metadata retention, the power to order metadata retention for up to a year. Don't know where the heck that came from. Just a poor idea on so many levels. If you have a basis for wanting, say, a telephone company to keep some information, great. Tell the judge, convince them, we'll collect it. Otherwise, just having us keep a year of metadata, just in case you might want it, turns telcos into state surveillance bodies, and that's just not what we do. The second would be the systemic vulnerability, the fact that there's a it's still not clear that the legislation closes the door on the idea of an encryption backdoor. I think that needs to be firmly nailed shut. It is a bedrock of a functioning internet. The third is compensation for doing for implementing lawful access. Partly, speaking on behalf of TELUS as a good corporate soldier, there's a crass corporate commercial. Like, we like to make money. If we're going to do something, we would like to be paid for it, especially if it means doing a lot to our network. Beyond that, I think there's a public policy purpose for compensation. It disciplines the conduct of lawful access, of law enforcement. They have limited budgets. If they have to pay for lawful access, and particularly network changes, it makes you be a little selective. Do I really need this? Is this really important? If everything is free, then, it's like decryption, tower dumps, and everything else for everybody because it's free. And I think, compensation has a role here in fairness and also in protecting civil rights.
I'll just add quickly. Quick show of hands. Who here is concerned about digital sovereignty? No matter how you define it, no matter what your perspective is on it. Okay, so everyone here is concerned. If you're concerned about digital sovereignty, you should be concerned about Part 2 of Bill C-22, because it gives the power to the government to force surveillance and other interception equipment into networks. And we've seen recently in the U.S. that those interception points can be hacked by the bad guys. The Kalea systems were hacked by Salt Typhoon. I think that was in 2024. Brent probably knows. I'm getting the nod. Okay. The FBI's wiretap system was hacked this year, recently, last couple of months. Anyway, they fessed up to it last week. So these are not hypothetical risks. These are very real risks, and we're seeing it play out in the U.S. Second thing is, of course, the threat to encryption, which everybody here has mentioned. I think it's just really incumbent on the government at this point and MPs to fix that, close that door as Bill suggested. So if you're concerned about digital sovereignty, I think you're concerned about Part 2 of the bill. So you got a new bill to learn up on and a new legislative process to track. So you're welcome.
Never a dull moment on the legislative front in Canada, and it's only going to get more exciting. One of the things that we talked about today quite a bit is what digital sovereignty, we came at it a number of different ways, but what digital sovereignty means in a Canadian context. And what I mean by that, and what I want to ask folks on the panel for whoever would like to answer, is what does digital sovereignty look like in a country that includes multiple sovereign nations and jurisdictions? There is that sense that the more voices that are at the table, the better the solution in the end. And of course, that also takes time. And we've talked about the importance of speed and the urgency of moving forward. I just wonder, what's a Canadian way to come at this culturally? I say that as someone who lives in the U.S. now. So really, it's more broad than that. Like, as a community, how do we think about coming at this with a sense of shared values and knowing that we do really value multiple voices at the table? And I think the majority of us do understand that when we do consultations properly and we engage people in good faith the right way as partners, we come to a better place in the end. So I guess I've made my position a little bit clearer, but I wonder if anyone else wants to talk about that at all.
I understand. No. Okay.
So at Chamber of Progress, we really believe in inclusive innovation. And when you look at the history of technology in Canada, you can see that the benefits have not been universally or equitably felt, right? This is not surprising to anybody in this room. If we look at the example of broadband deployment, we know that First Nations communities, Métis, folks in the North, These were some of the last communities to receive, and still are waiting, some of the last communities to receive fast, reliable, affordable internet. And so I think there's a real risk that unless we take a more deliberate and consultative and thoughtful approach, we can replicate this on AI. And I think Shelley captured this well in her comments on the previous panel. When I heard Jeff speak earlier today, I really wanted to thank him for sharing his family story with us and grounding us in a kind of broader view of these technologies and where they fit, and how they affect communities across the country and across all of North America. When I think about what inclusive technology looks like going forward, I think let's follow their lead. The First Nations Technology Council in BC is doing some really interesting work right now. They just received a large grant to work on AI, the development of AI adoption materials, and training for First Nations across British Columbia. I'm going to be following that really closely because I think that looks really exciting. I think Jeff's words earlier are instructive to us. So my advice would be, or my approach rather would be, let's listen and let's see how we can help.
So I don't have a great answer to what does Canada need to do for Canada's digital sovereignty, because as we've mentioned before, there's so many definitions. But what I always come back to is, how do we, when we think about how do we accommodate everyone, the internet was built for everyone that wants the internet. Everyone has different goals and different reasons for using it. Sometimes we don't have a choice because the services we need in our day-to-day life use the internet. But, at the end of the day, the reason that the internet can offer so many opportunities is because it was built in a tech-neutral, general-purpose kind of way that allows people to innovate and build things and use it in ways that benefits them. That said, while nobody here will have the same definition of digital sovereignty, there are some principles that, knowingly or not, we do agree to. And those are the principles that allow the internet to exist in the first place. So the Internet Society developed a tool, it's called the Internet Impact Assessment Toolkit, that really lays out this framework of principles that, when government started thinking about, well, what does it mean, to have an internet, and what kind of an internet do we want? One that doesn't just exist, but one that's open, globally connected, secure, and trustworthy. And our framework really lays out some common principles that help us understand, well, what does an internet need to exist in the first place? An accessible infrastructure, decentralized management, common global identifiers. These are things that, by the very fact of us using the internet and deciding to build companies on the internet and to innovate and build new technologies, we agree to these principles because we've decided that the internet is valuable to us. And so we're going to voluntarily work in this way so that we can continue having benefits of the internet. So I don't have a very specific answer on what Canada should do about its digital sovereignty, but what I will say is that I think it's important to be very clear and direct about goals. As a parent of a neurospicy child, I've learned to really appreciate the value and importance of direct communication. So being very clear on the goals that we want to achieve and the kind of benefits that we want to experience by using the internet, but also being very clear about making sure that if what we actually want to achieve involves an internet, considering the means to get there in a way that respects the internet. So the Internet Impact Assessment Toolkit was designed for just that purpose. We used it with governments all over the world to help them understand how decisions could impact the internet, and it's definitely open for the government of Canada to have a look and review when they're thinking about these discussions.
It's a great tool and toolkit, and you should definitely check it out. Very well said, both of you. And I just want to as well come back to, because Natalie said something really key, this notion of a principles-based approach. Whenever we're talking about really complex issues that have a multiplicity of views associated with them, taking a principles-based approach allows us to align on those principles that we share in common without necessarily getting into the solution space where we might disagree. And it gives us a platform to align around and agree on as a basis for moving forward. And part of the challenge I think we face as a society is too often we go right to the solutions, disagree on how to solve the problem, when if we took a step back and had that conversation at a principles level, we might find it much more constructive, and certainly it would feel better to have the conversation. We're coming to a close, so I have one last question for our panelists, and it's about looking ahead. Near-term priorities, the next 12 to 24 months. If you could wave a magic wand, and what is one decision that you would like to see us get right in this country in the next 12 to 24? One concrete action that would improve outcomes for Canadians. Who wants to go first? Bill, it's you.
In the very short term, I think a clear definition of digital sovereignty and implementing it by the federal government and implementing it through its procurement policy in a proportionate, targeted manner so that we can stake out control where we need to, which doesn't mean closing ourselves off from the rest of the world. And if I could sneak in a second, and this is also industrial policy. Actually, there's so many things to get right, but the second would be figuring out how to go from research to commercialization better. And I think it's a combination of things, preparing our society for it through training, probably some competition and tax policy issues in there. And if there's a third, and this is actually the one that means in some ways the most to me, is getting the non-industrial policy right, getting the socio-economic policy side of this, the people side of it, the impacts on, because the decisions we make now, much like the decisions on, say, pollution and climate that were made in 50s and 60s that affect future generations, the decisions we make now are going to project themselves into the future. Let's do our best to to come up with policies that minimize the harms to democracy and to individuals and maximize the benefits, which is a tall ask of a government, but, they're there to do hard things. Sorry, that was 3, sorry.
Well, now I'm taking 3. Just kidding. I'll do 2. So I mean, I think one is, I think we need to, first, we need to shift the focus away from data localization to data security and data control. I think encryption is going to be an important part of this. As I mentioned earlier, no matter where your data is, it's very hard to escape U.S. jurisdiction and other jurisdictions. So let's focus on technical solutions that keep Canadians' data private and secure, like encryption, which is my segue to my second point. Let's fix part 2 of Bill C-22. Let's make sure that we don't include a workaround on encryption, and let's make sure that we aren't weakening the security of our national infrastructure through the installation of surveillance apparatus. Those would be my 2.
I'm going to cheat and say 3. So first of all, I think that if I could wave a magic wand, I would love to see more investment into community-centered connectivity solutions. So at the Internet Society, we focus on connecting the unconnected and protecting the connected. So part of connecting the unconnected is actually really beneficial to creating a stronger, more robust, and more resilient Internet. And as I mentioned before, keeping more traffic local. And it helps people create ways to access the internet on their own terms. And it also helps address the affordability solution. So as we're, seeing the government invest billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars into AI innovation, I think we also need to be investing still into those community-centered connectivity solutions to make sure that they are also part of participating on the internet. And secondly, I think we need to stop C-22's lawful access orders. Not only will this mandate insecurity into potentially any one of our businesses and our individual lives, it will totally destroy the reputation of our business sector and our tech sector. This happened in Australia. We did a study at the Internet Society looking at the impact of Australia's TOLA Act, which has similar powers, and we had respondents reporting like billions of Australian dollars in losses from the reputational hit that their industry took after that law came to be. So that the solution is like not having those kind of powers at all, because what they'll end up doing is just creating a vulnerability. It'll create honeypots, and it just destroys the foundation of security that the internet needs in the first place. And then third, I think, doubling down on Josh's mention about data localization, I think it's okay that some data doesn't belong on the internet, right? I think it's important to understand, our ability to control what data is collected and how it's used, et cetera, et cetera. And that includes data that is metadata and can be combined to form identifiable data. So I think instead of focusing on we need to keep all data in Canada, we need to focus on privacy, and we need to focus on keeping data secure no matter where it travels and no matter where it's sitting. Because unless we're doing that, it doesn't matter if it's sitting in Canada, if we're living in a time where we could be prevented from securing it and locking it down from encryption. It doesn't make it any safer in Canada if we can't store it and secure it in the strongest way possible.
I think we're almost out of time.
1 minute.
So I just wanted to say, Franca, you did it. Congratulations on a very successful Digital Access Day. There's not a lot of digital policy events in Ottawa in general, and so this is an important one. And so congrats for pulling off another great event.
Well, with that, and we did come in at 4:40 exactly on time. Franca has delegated to me just a couple of closing words. I will keep it short. And of course, Josh already took the first talking point. Franca, thank you for everything that you have done to make this day a success. The roster of really knowledgeable and experienced folks with interesting perspectives to share on this stage today. I learned a lot, and I really appreciate it, and I know folks in the audience do as well. I also want to thank once again our sponsors. Dr. Wendy Sukier from the Metropolitan University's Diversity Institute Future Skills Center. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bill and TELUS, thank you so much for your support. We appreciate it. And Natalie and the Internet Society, boy, we couldn't do half the things we do without our partnership with the Internet Society, and we deeply appreciate that as well. So I just wanted to say thank you so much. Reinforcing one core takeaway as we walk out the door, defining digital strategy is going to be part of the equation. And I know that that's hard to do. We're generally going to disagree. Each of us is going to have a perspective. So the question then is, what are the principles we can align around to help us have a constructive conversation and work together and moving the dialogue forward into execution, into real actions we can consider that will move the needle, that will help us achieve the goals we want to achieve, and then move into execution. I feel like if we take that kind of constructive approach, a group like this can do anything. I really believe that. So thank you very much for your time today. Enjoy happy hour. I hope we get to have a drink together.